Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, the paper I'm going to present is actually not a paper, it's a collection of various papers, and they have been conducted with many co-authors. And it's all about migration, as the conference title suggests. Now, I started working on migration a long time ago, more than 30 years, actually more than 35 years. And when I did that, migration was something we associated with Canada, United States, Australia, maybe New Zealand, but that was it. So Europe, despite being frequented by migrants, did not consider itself as a migration continent. Countries in Europe thought about migration as something very temporary. That has completely changed. And if we just have a look at the shares of foreign-born across different countries in Europe, if you compare Germany and Canada, they are very similar. Now Switzerland is having 1/3 of its population being born in another country, very similar to the number one here, which is Australia. And if you compare the yellow or the reddish and the green columns, you see that in each of the countries on this slide, immigration has dramatically increased over the last 20 years. And if we continue that graph for other countries, we will see a very similar tendency. That, of course, is one of the reasons why people also in economics these days are very interested in migration. If you would have had this conference 30 years ago, there would be 5 people in the room. Now, dramatically, the development has been in Germany, where migration is now one of the really top issues in the political debate. If you look at this particular graph, migration has increased from 12.6% on the workforce to 19.5% on the workforce in just 1 decade. So large changes across many European countries, and migration is not anymore considered to be an issue which is just something of the new world. Now, economic research, and of course many of you in this room know about that, but let me just kind of categorize that a little bit, has basically traditionally looked at three different groups of research. First of all, we are concerned about the migrant himself or herself. Some of the work today, this morning or this afternoon, the first paper I saw was interested in the migrant, the migration decision, the remigration decision, the assimilation of immigrants, integration, the children of immigrants, remittances, etc., etc. The second big block is about non-migrants, people who actually don't migrate, but they are affected by migration. And these people may live in the destination countries, or they may live in the origin countries. And as I will show you in a minute, this is actually the largest block of migration research that has been conducted over the past years. And the third block, and that's something which is probably increasing at the moment, is about the interaction of immigrants and natives. So much of the political economy literature, which has started to kind of grow 10 years ago, is concerned with those interactions. Today I want to talk about the second block, the impact migration has on the receiving country, on wages, employment, crime, etc., etc. Now, if we look at the research of migration in the economic literature, we have prepared that for a handbook article we are writing at the moment. You can see that when I started, there was actually hardly anything happening in migration. There were just 5-6 people working on it. But that has dramatically changed. If you look at the publications have increased quite dramatically. And the blue columns here are basically papers that are concerned with the impact of immigration on receiving countries or on sending countries. So you can see that this clearly is the largest bulk of literature which has grown over time. Now, what is also interesting is that in the early days of migration research in economics, research was focusing on the United States, but that has changed again quite dramatically. So today, the majority of papers are written about countries other than United States. For a particular period that was Europe, but now there are more and more papers written also about Asia, South America, and other continents. So very interesting development in research. A key question, and that brings me back to what I actually want to talk about in the public debate on immigration, is how does immigration affect the welfare of residents in the receiving country? So the entire political debate in many countries is actually driven by that particular question. So what does migration do to us? Does it enhance our welfare? Does it take away our jobs? Does it decrease our wages, etc., etc.? Labor economists have worked on that quite a lot, and they usually think about immigration as a labor supply shock. And that is very convenient because that allows us to take ready-made theories to investigate the possible impact migration has on receiving countries. Now, how can adjustment take place? Well, there are three different ways in which a receiving country can adjust to labor supply shocks induced by immigration. So one of them is absorption through changes in the industry structure. So that would be conveniently modeled in a Mead, Heckscher-Ohlin type trade framework, where you trade goods in international markets. Migration happens. Migration, say, is unskilled. If you have two industries, one industry is produces intensively with unskilled labor, the other one with skilled labor. So what would happen in such a world is that the industry that uses unskilled labor more intensively would grow relative to the other industry because prices are set in international markets through Rybczynski. Wages are also fixed, and everything will basically be adjusted by trade between the two countries. So nothing happens to wages and prices. And there are a number of papers that have looked at that particular adjustment structure. A second structure or a second way to adjust is through technology. And my favorite example is about wine. I'm sure Daniel is, very much teamed in on that example. So if you go to Napa Valley, for instance, and look at the wine industry and compare that to Hunter Valley in Australia. Now, two Cabernets, red wines, produced, one in Australia, one in California. You find them in the supermarket in the UK for a very similar price, just next to each other. But the production technology is different. Australia is incredibly capital intensive. If you look at the vineyards, they are much further away so that machines can do the harvest, while Napa, many of the older vineyards are still very, very labor intensive. And that has to do with much easier access to cheap labor in California than in Australia. So that just gives you an idea that one adjustment mechanism is simply through technology. Now, the third adjustment mechanism, and that's the one I would like to talk about, is absorption through changes in wages and employment. And most of the literature in economics has actually focused on this third adjustment mechanism. And before we so what I would like to do on the following slides is to take you through the canonical model, which imposes some structure how we as economists can think about this adjustment mechanism. and then kind of go to the empirical literature and try to explain why there is so much, how should I call it, disagreement about what the impact of immigration is on wages or employment. And one of the reasons is that actually the different papers we see in the literature measure very different things, depending on the empirical approach you take and how that is reflected in the canonical model. And another reason is because different papers ask different questions. And I want to take you through these two blocks of what we see as a lot of variation in the literature. So let's just look at the simplest possible model, which we call the canonical model. And in that model, output Y is produced by combining capital and labor according to a very simple Cobb-Douglas production function. Labor, let's assume, is a CES aggregate. And let's just assume we have skilled and unskilled labor. We can extend that. We can add additional nests, and I will come back to that a little bit later. So then the elasticity of substitution between low and high skilled labor is given by 1 over 1 minus beta. Capital supply is given by R equals K to the lambda. So R is the price of capital, and 1 over lambda is the elasticity of capital supply. So this very simple model gives you a very simple labor demand function. So the change in log wages is equal to phi times the change in log labor demand, where phi is the inverse labor demand elasticity, and that inverse labor demand elasticity is a function of the inverse elasticity of capital supply lambda, the capital share in output, or total costs alpha, and total aggregate labor supply is given by this equation. So the change in aggregate labor supply is equal to the change in the labor market through immigration, so the labor supply shock, di tilde, plus the response of natives to that particular labor supply shock, and that's the change in labor supply of resident workers denoted by R. Okay? Now we can split that up also into labor supply for the different skill groups, and you basically get exactly the same equation. The second term, d log LR, of course, is endogenous. So that's a function of how natives respond to the labor supply shock. And that's very important. And that kind of tells you, if you want to investigate the impact of immigration on wages and ignore the labor supply side, you ignore the effect on employment, you basically get a very, very incomplete picture. Yeah? So you could well have a migration shock affecting wages, not affecting wages, because everything is basically absorbed by labor supply responses of natives. So the total aggregate wage effect. So then, of course, in equilibrium, the labor supply and labor demand has to be equal. So you get basically the total aggregate wage effect. And that is the equation, or that is the canonical model's equivalent to the equation which is usually estimated in the literature. So it's the change in wages as a function of the change in labor supply in response to the immigration shock, where phi is the inverse labor demand elasticity. So that expression equals exactly phi if eta is equal to 0. So eta is the labor supply elasticity. So if the labor supply curve is vertical, this term is equal to phi. This term is equal to minus alpha if the capital, if lambda goes to infinity. So basically exactly equal to the capital share in output. lambda equal going to infinity basically means that capital is infinitely elastic in supply. And it is equal to 0 if capital is inelastic, is infinitely elastic. So you can already see that there is a lot of discussion in the literature. So some of the models which are basically using semi-structural derivations to determine how the impact of immigration is on wages, depend, for instance, on the assumption about capital supply. David Card always assumes capital is infinitely elastic, and George Borjas always assumes that capital is completely inelastic. Yeah? So it's important to always have that in mind. There is a lot of ambivalence in the way. For instance, George Borjas' 2003 paper finds large effects of immigration. He assumes in his semi-structural part in the last part of his paper that capital supply is completely inelastic. And Ottaviano and Perry and Manacorda and co-authors find that capital is find very small effects, and they assume that capital is actually totally elastic in supply. Now, what is the total skill-specific? Let's just take now the canonical model, and let's just see what are the parameters this canonical model is identifying in the empirical equivalence, to which we will come in a minute. So the first one is the total skill-specific wage effect. So that would be regressing the overall wages on the immigration shock. And that total skill-specific wage effect has basically two terms. The first term, which is the total aggregate wage effect of immigration. So that term is equal to 0 if capital, for instance, is perfectly elastic. So on average, immigration will not have any impact on wages. However, it will have distributional impacts, and that's the second term. So the second term, let's start with C, is telling you something about the relative density of immigrants along the distribution of Gs. So Gs could be different skill levels. So if immigrants are more dense at, say, G equals low skilled, then the term in parentheses will be positive. The term in front of the parenthesis is negative. So at that particular part in the distribution, immigration will have a negative effect on wages. Okay? And I will show you evidence for that. So that model works incredibly well if you take that to the data. So the native skill group that is more exposed to immigration and hence more likely to compete with immigrants for jobs experiences wage declines that are relative to the skill group less exposed to immigration. Now another effect, and this effect is often estimated in the literature, either the total effect, which is basically the fourth term, we had that on the previous slide, or the native skill specific effect, which is this total term here. Another parameter which is very often estimated in the literature is the partial wage effect. This partial wage effect is basically the effect of immigration of one skill group relative to another skill group. The partial wage effects are informative only about the distributional, but not about the absolute effects of immigration. Okay? And that's given by, if we go to the canonical model, 1 minus beta divided by 1 plus eta times 1 minus beta. So with that in mind, let's just look at what the literature is actually estimating. So the estimation of the effects of immigration is challenging. First of all, because there is an identification problem. What we are interested in is the causal effect of immigration. What we usually observe is the factual. So suppose we are interested in the impact of immigration on wages in the UK. We observe wages of natives before immigration happens and after immigration happens. We don't observe how wages would have developed in the absence of immigration. And that's a missing counterfactual. So the entire migration literature and actually the entire applied literature is about the construction of missing counterfactuals. And a paper is a good paper or a bad paper depending on how plausible that counterfactual is constructed. Okay? Now, the basic idea in this migration literature is to slice the labor market into sub-labor markets. That could be different regions in Canada, that could be different occupation groups, different skill groups, etc., etc. And then to use the variation of immigration into these different sub-labor markets across whatever you choose those sub-labor markets to be. Then you still have a problem because there may be sorting into these different sub-labor markets. So you need to exogenize the labor supply shocks into each of these sub-labor markets. I don't want to talk about that today. I just assume in what I am doing now that we know how to do that, okay? I'll give you some examples when I come to the applications a little bit later. So, let's just look at what's estimated in the literature. First of all, the total aggregate wage effect of immigration. So the total aggregate wage effect of immigration could be estimated by regressing the change in wages in a particular region at a particular point in time, say from T1 to T2, on the immigration shock and whatever other characteristics you would want to throw in. So I just ignore that here. So the parameter which we obtain, we call that here theta W pure, speaks to the question, how does immigration affect regional resident wages? As I pointed out before, if we go back to the canonical model, that parameter would be equal to 0 if capital is infinitely elastic, and it would be negative if capital is not infinitely elastic. Yeah. Now the second effect is the total skill-specific wage effect of immigration. It's precisely the same equation, only that on the left-hand side I have the log wages or the log mean wages in a particular region of individuals of skill level G. That parameter speaks to the question, how does immigration affect regional resident wages for skill group G? It's, of course, a reasonable question and an important parameter. If we go back to the canonical model, that parameter corresponds to the expression down here through which derivation I have taken you a little bit earlier. Yeah? So it will depend, if we ignore the first term, it will depend on whether at that particular point in the skill distribution, immigration is less or more dense than on average. Now, the relative wage effect of immigration is a different parameter again. So that parameter regresses the change in log wages of a particular skill group on the change in immigration into that particular skill group, conditioning on time region fixed effect, on time skill group fixed effects. That parameter speaks to the question, how does immigration affect regional resident wages of one skill group relative to another? It links skill-specific immigration shocks to skill-specific wage changes while controlling at the same time, as I pointed out, for region and skill-specific time effects. So that parameter corresponds to minus eta times 1 minus beta divided by 1 plus eta times 1 minus beta, where beta again was the elasticity of substitution between the two skill groups. Yeah? That parameter by definition will always be negative. It will also be negative if the impact of immigration on both skill groups is positive. Because if it is less positive on one skill group than on the other skill group, this parameter will be negative. So it's informative only about the distributional effects. And then let's kind of come last but not least to George Borger's 2003 paper, which identifies an even more specific parameter. So we call this approach the national skill cell approach. The national skill cell approach, you regress wages of skill group G and age group A on the immigration shock into skill group G and age group A, conditioning on the changes in GT fixed effects and AT fixed effects. That parameter doesn't come straight from the canonical model I had on the previous slides. For that, we need to extend the model by having CES aggregates of the two skill groups I have shown you before into, say, different age groups. It's based on the idea that identification comes from the fact that workers, even within skill groups, are not perfect substitutes across different experience groups. Okay? Now it speaks to the question, how does immigration affect the wages of one experience group relative to another experience group within the same education group? It links education age-specific immigration shocks at the national level to education age-specific wage changes while controlling for education and age-specific time effects. So these are, I would think, 90% of the papers in that literature using either one of those approaches. And as you can see, if we link those the parameter theta NSC to the canonical model, it is again a different combination of parameters. It also includes elasticities of substitution of different age groups within a particular education group. So these different empirical approaches estimate different parameters, and the different parameters address different questions and are not comparable with each other. Nevertheless, in the public debate, papers are compared, saying, oh, Borchers finds something negative, Card finds something positive. So how comes? Well, they estimate different things. Okay? So let me give you some examples. First example goes back to a paper I've written with Tommaso and Frattini and Ian Preston many years ago, when the Minimum Wage Commission in the UK was still independent. So they were interested in the impact immigration has at the minimum wage. So at the time, the minimum wage in the UK was at the 5th percentile of the wage distribution. Well, there was no approach that estimated that. So that kept us thinking about how we can do that. And the idea was to estimate the effect of immigration along the distribution of native wages. So underlying was the idea that, well, if you look at natives and immigrants at the same percentile of the distribution, then they are very likely to be at very similar positions in the labor market and therefore be substitutable. So instead of skill groups, we simply thought about taking different parts of the wage distribution as the different skill groups. So we estimated the impact of migration along the entire skill distribution, where skills were percentiles of the native wage distribution. Now, that brought us to some additional insight, because when we looked at the data, we saw that immigrants are actually not located at the native distribution where we would expect them based on their education and their experience. To give you an example, if you look, for instance, at the occupational distribution of immigrants in the early 2000s and natives. And here we have 7 different categories which are ordered by the mean wages which we observe. What we see is that, natives, about 23%, are in the lowest 3 groups. Earlier immigrants, 22%, are in the lowest 3 groups. However, recent immigrants, 41%, are in the lowest 3 groups. Although the recent immigrants, if you compare them to natives, have higher levels of education. So what happens actually is a dramatic downgrading. Immigrants come to the UK, the surgeon doesn't speak the language, and he will start working as a nurse, and then moving up the distribution while acquiring complementary human capital. Now, if you do that along the distribution of native wages, so this is the distribution of native wages along the percentiles, it's of course a flat line. So one question we ask is, where are the immigrants along that distribution? Now, that's where the immigrants are, predominantly at the lower end, and some kind of city workers at the upper end. So more density at the lower end, more density at the upper end, and less density in the middle of the distribution. Coming back to the canonical model would tell us that the wage impact on the left-hand side should be more negative than in the middle of the distribution, because we have more concentration of immigrants at that part of the distribution. Now suppose you would like to allocate immigrants based on their education and experience, as you have them in the, say, labor force data. Well, that's where they would be positioned. Actually, predominantly at the upper part of the distribution, because immigrants are better educated. So downgrading is the difference between these 2 lines. And you see immediately that approaches, like for instance George Borger's approach, which requires you to allocate immigrants to cells where they compete with natives according to their age and education, would basically allocate them along the red line, while where they are in the labor market is along the green line. Yeah? So you get that completely wrong. Okay, so let's just come back to the estimation. This is where they are in the distribution, and if we take the canonical model, we would expect, say, more negative wage effects at the low end and potentially positive wage effects further up. And that's basically this parameter here. So the pure wage effect, and let's just think about G as percentiles of the distribution, would be this term which we have discussed a little bit earlier. Yeah. So let's see how that looks like in the data. This is again the distribution of immigrants along the native wage distribution. So how do wages look like? Well, it's actually quite remarkable. So these are the wage effects. Wage effect theta G W pure along the native wage distribution is negative below the 20th percentile and then becomes positive. So basically exactly a mirror image. And if you do that, we have done that with German data. So the canonical model, if it predicts where actually wage effects are negative or positive, works remarkably well to kind of replicate what's in the data. Now note that this is estimated for every percentile. We run one regression and then we connect the dots. This is not dependent on the distributional graphs which I have shown you before. Yeah, it's not just inverting the distributional graph. That would be basically how we would do that if we take the structure of the model serious. Yeah, the red graph is done with completely different, just by regressing native wages at the different percentiles of the distribution on the immigration shock. So the summary is basically that, given the dramatic increase in real wages at that time, immigration effects have been relatively small. This paper was fantastic because they all liked us. So the Daily Mail, when the Low Pay Commission was publishing that thing, reported about negative wage effects of immigration, and the Financial Times said immigration has overall positive effects. Yeah, so everybody along the political spectrum could take part of the paper and be happy about it. Now remember, we had a meeting with the Treasury and the Low Pay Commission and the Home Office, who all had different agendas with respect to migration at that time. Well, they picked the different parts of the paper which they really liked and wanted to be pushed in the public debate. Well, that was the only paper which pleased everybody, or didn't please anybody. So we extend that at the moment, and we work on that at the moment. And so one interesting thing is that actually the position of migrants in the native wage distribution, and this is the first graph I showed you, they are predominantly at the lower end of the, sorry, this is where they should be according to their age and education structure. Yeah. So where they are is actually this graph here. But what happens if we follow these cohorts over time? Well, they actually assimilate. And as you can see, after about 30 years, the yellow line is very similar to the blue line. So that means there is this ripple effect through the distribution. So that means every cohort of immigrants starts to have an impact on that part of the distribution where they are located, but then they move through the distribution. The surgeon is first a nurse and leaves the nursing profession. So then becomes a surgeon. So there is a negative supply shock on the nurses and a positive supply shock on the surgeons. Now, in order to capture that and to estimate that, of course, you need to impose structure, which is precisely what we are doing in some ongoing work. Another important aspect of immigration, and if you want to understand what impact it has on the labor market, is actually the survival of immigrants. Now, in case of the UK, after about 5 years, some immigration groups are basically to 50% already out of the country. They leave the country. Now, that means there are negative supply shocks along the distribution again throughout migration. And those supply shocks differ across different immigrant groups, as you can see in this graph. And we put all this together in ongoing work in a dynamic model with one of our PhD students. Now, just to give you some idea how this looks like in very rough first drafts of the model, these are the densities you have in the data, and the model we have developed is creating densities which are actually not too far away from those which we see in the data. Okay, so my second example is kind of emphasizing that what I have shown you so far and the vast literature on immigration is actually using repeated cross-sectional data. That's all the data we had until very recently. However, now, and we saw that in the Toronto data a little bit earlier, we have actually administrative data, and we have large data sets which allow to follow individuals over time. What I want to demonstrate to you in this second part of my lecture is that such data allows us to answer many more questions than the data we have used so far. So the papers I want to talk about go back to an experiment in Germany, which I will talk about a little bit more in detail, and illustrate that the additional information in longitudinal data allows identification of additional parameters. So let's go back to the wage effects. Again, we are trying to estimate skill specific, but let's just look at the pure total aggregate wage effect of immigration. So that's the effect which you basically get by, pushing the labor supply curve down the labor demand curve in a very simple diagram. Yeah? The effect is given by phi divided by 1 minus phi eta. And the question is whether phi divided by 1 minus phi eta, this parameter, which we all claim we estimate, is actually identified from cross-sectional data by running the regression which I have here in the green box. So that regression, I call that parameter gamma R. Gamma R is the effect of immigration on regional wages. Is that equal to the structural parameter which pushes the labor supply curve down the labor demand curve or not? Now, let's just think about what we are doing if we use regional cross-sectional data to identify the impact of immigration on wages. Let's look at the first box. In period 0, we look at employed natives in that particular period, in a particular region R. And we do that for many regions. So the wage we observe is the average wage of that population. Let's call that wage log WR0. In period 1, we basically do the same thing. So we look at the natives employed in period 1 and we compute the log wage of that population. And then we take the difference. Okay. Now, there's of course an issue. In period 1, some of the natives that have worked in period 0 are not working anymore. They left the workforce as response to immigration. That's the light blue outflow column there. And then others have joined the workforce. So if those inflows and those outflows are selective, then of course we have a problem, because the change in regional wages in response to the immigration shock does not pick up the parameter we would like to identify. The parameter we would like to identify would compare the blue box on the left side with the blue and light blue box on the right side. Okay? We want to know the change in wages of those who are employed in period 0 and how they would be in period 1. Okay, so what we can do with longitudinal data is we can follow those individuals who are employed in period 0 and who are still employed in period 1. So the only problem we have is that the light blue box has drifted out of the labor market. Now assume, and go back to simple econometric classes, that that selection is time invariant. That those individuals who leave or join the labor market may be selected, but they are selected on time constant characteristics: ability, talent, productivity. Okay? Then, by running differences of those who are employed in both periods, we basically eliminate selection. Yeah? So the Heckman selection term, if you just do it with a simple Probit model or whatever, would be basically time constant and would be eliminated. And that's precisely what we do in our application. So we can take that through the canonical model and can write down the selectivity bias we obtain when we use cross-sectional data. And that selectivity bias is given by the last term in this particular equation here. So that selectivity bias would be basically 0 if what we call the efficiency-weighted labor supply elasticity is equal to the population-weighted labor supply elasticity. So the efficiency-weighted labor supply elasticity is the labor supply elasticity which is basically taking account of the fact that, we may get out-migration which is selective, or in-migration which is selective. Yeah? So the difference between what we get in a cross-section or what we do if we follow the methodology outlined here with longitudinal data is that particular bias. So the regional wage effect can basically be decomposed into a pure wage effect and a composition effect through inflows and outflows. The pure wage effect can be identified from longitudinal data if selection is actually due to unobserved time constant individual characteristics. Okay, so let's take that to the data. So the policy we use here is actually a remarkable policy. It is going back to January 91, when, West Germany, just after the unification, announced, or Germany at that time already, announced to open the border to the Czech Republic for all Czechs who would like to work in a particular border region in Germany. So these people were allowed to come in the morning, but they had to go back in the evening, and that was very strongly monitored. So to show you that in a picture, the light gray is West Germany, the dark gray is East Germany, and the regions which were affected by that particular policy is the reddish region here and the blue region here. This is the Czech Republic, so Czech workers could come to Germany and they could work in all those municipalities. Also those we exclude from our analysis because they are too close to East Germany and there is migration from East Germany into those areas as well. Yeah? So they could come to those areas, but they had to return later on. So this experiment is beautiful for two reasons. First of all, the labor supply shock is a pure labor supply shock. It's not something which shifts the demand curve as well, as most migrations actually do and are usually ignored. And secondly, it gives us two identification strategies. The first is a simple Mariel boatlift type identification strategy. So we can take this region here and compare it to matched regions in Germany where Czech workers were not allowed to go and couldn't go. And the second identification strategy is actually taking the distance from the Czech border. Because you had to return in the evening, migration became very costly the further away you would want to look for a job from the Czech border. So the employment shares of Czech nationals after the implementation of the policy went after 2 years up to 3% on average in that blue area. Very close to the border it was 10%, and far away from the border it was about 1 to 0%. So large variation and a very massive shock of immigrants coming to those blue areas. So this is basically in the pre-time in the rest of Germany, where immigration from the Czech Republic continued to be equal to 0, basically. So let's just look at the wage effects. Let's estimate the wage effect. So we take the inflow between 1990 and 1992 as the immigration inflow in this particular analysis. So if you look at wages, so in the pre-period, we shouldn't see basically anything. That's, so to say, the placebo. So the immigration shock between 1990 and 1992 should not have any wage impact between 87 and 1990. And you can see that in this graph. Now, the regional wage effect is also estimated to be more or less 0 in the years afterwards. However, if we estimate the corrected wage effect by basically eliminating selection, wage effects all of a sudden become negative. They are not large, but a 10 percentage point increase in immigration would reduce wages by incumbent workers by about 1.5%. And the difference is actually explained by what we call changes in composition, which improve wages in the region. So those workers who actually entered the workforce and those workers who left the workforce were selected so that the overall, that the composition became better. And if we don't correct for that, we actually estimate a zero wage effect. Okay, so last part of my lecture, I would like to extend this to employment effects. And we haven't spoken so far about employment effects. And there I would like to go back to, so every parameter we estimate, whether it's impact on migration, or anything, needs to answer a particular question. Every parameter gets life through the question that parameter is answering. Yeah? So it's very important to always think very carefully about what question is the parameter answering, which I am estimating here. Okay? And sometimes you have papers which claim to answer a particular question, and then you go through the paper, and in the end, actually, they answer completely different questions. That's not good. And it also leads to a lot of confusion, in particular in a very hot debate, like a debate about immigration. So I give you two questions here on the employment effects of migration. First is, what is the impact of an immigration shock on local wages and employment? What is the impact of an immigration shock on local wages and employment? And the second question is, what is the impact of an immigration shock on wages and employment of individuals who were employed in the area at the time of the shock? So think very carefully about those two questions. Which one is important? The first one? Come on, some action here. Who thinks the first one is important? Or the second? Well, sure, I'm coming to that. No, is the second question important? Or are they both important? Second one, okay. Perhaps. Which question you think is around in the public debate when we talk about immigration? Second, maybe, yeah. What do politicians have in mind when they talk about employment effects of immigration? Do they think about regional employment effects? Or do they think about the negative impact of immigration on those who are in employment when immigration happens? Well, the first question can be answered with repeated cross-sectional data. And actually only the first question can be answered with repeated cross-sectional data. And actually all the studies in the literature are answering only the first question. Although very often in the mind of people, well, they think maybe the second question is answered as well. The second question requires longitudinal data. It cannot be answered with repeated cross-sectional data. And I will show you that for our particular application, the difference between the parameter estimates that answer the first question or the second question are absolutely astounding. Okay? So if we take, let's just go back a little bit and let's decompose that. So the regional effect of immigration would regress this term, ER1 minus ER0, divided by ER0, which is basically the employment change in a particular region of native workers on the immigration shock, which is delta IR. Let's decompose that term. So that term consists or can be decomposed in three components. The first component is the displacement component. It's ERN divided by ER0. It's basically the employment of natives in that region in the second period relative to the first period. The second is the crowding out effect. So that's the share of individuals who work in period 1 in region R, but who were not employed in that region in the base period. So these are individuals who are basically crowded out. So the crowding out effect can be positive or negative. So this can be also individuals who otherwise would work in the area, but don't work in the area because migration happens. Or individuals who are in non-employment when immigration happens and decide to stay in non-employment because of the immigration shock. And the third term is the reallocation effect. That's the share of individuals who were employed in region 0 in the base period, but have moved in period 1 to employment in another region. So that was the big debate between Dave Card and George Borchers. Yeah? George Borchers always claimed that immigration may have much larger wage effects if we consider those individuals who move away because of immigration. Dave Card said that's not true. In the end, with the data available, that question was not really answerable. So let's look at the employment effects. So this is the regional effect, answering the first question. And the regional effect basically tells us that the 10 percentage point increase in the inflow of Czech workers between 1990 and 1992 decreases local native employment by about 8.7% by 1993. This is a huge effect. It's nearly 1-to-1. So for every Czech worker, 0.87 natives are not in employment in that particular region. Okay? So that was basically what we did in our first paper, because we just simply did the same thing the literature was doing. So we didn't think that through. And people didn't appreciate that. Some people thought this was too big effects, but that's what the data tells you. Okay? However, if we look at the displacement effect, which is basically answering the second question, then the picture looks completely different. A 10 percentage point increase in the inflow of Czech workers between 1990 and 1992 decreases employment probabilities of natives employed in the area in 1990 by only 1.5%. And the effect is basically zero in 1995. So those workers who have been in employment are more or less not affected by the immigration shock. Yeah? So two questions, same data, completely different answers. So where is the difference coming from? Well, the difference is coming from the crowding out effect. The crowding out effect is actually native workers who would have entered employment in that particular region, not entering employment, and either coming from other regions or coming from non-employment. Now I will tell you in a minute what these workers are actually, or what a part of these workers are doing. And the reallocation effect, which attracted so much attention in the literature, is actually very small. Yeah? So individuals leaving employment in that region to go into employment into another region, that's basically zero. So everything is explained by the crowding out effect. Now we can do these decompositions into all types of detail. And let me just focus here on column number 3. So that's the crowding out effect. And we can basically look at the crowding out effect and distinguish between inflows from non-employment or inflows from employment in other regions. And the largest part of the crowding out effect is by not happening inflows from non-employment. And again, we can distinguish here non-employment from individuals who enter the labor market or who are from the same region and are in unemployment, or who are from other regions. And again, the largest part is through individuals who otherwise would have entered the labor market, young workers, but who don't enter the labor market because of the immigration shock. And if we follow those individuals, we actually see what happens as a response to that immigration shock is a very strong uptake in apprenticeship training. So young workers who otherwise would have entered the labor market just after school are actually going into apprenticeship training, or a large part of them. Okay, so let me kind of come to an end. So what matters for policy, of course, is the causal effect of immigration. The estimation of such effects is very challenging as it requires plausible and credible variation to construct counterfactuals answering the question, what would have happened if migration had not taken place? We need to be very precise, we believe, in our questions and ensure that the empirical strategy we actually use answer exactly those questions, and we have to point out under what assumptions that is actually happening. Different empirical approaches identify different parameters that address very different questions, as I have shown you. And they are not comparable. Yeah, to say, oh, well, David Card finds that, George Borras finds that. They're doing different things, not comparable, different parameters. To bring them together, you could do that within a canonical model. Yeah. And better data of longitudinal and administrative nature. And I've just given you a very small glimpse of what can be actually identified from that additional information we have in administrative longitudinal data, allows us to identify additional parameters that address important policy questions. Now, if you are interested in what we are doing, as we are kind of starting a new research institute in Berlin, where we have what we call the Global Migration Information Hub, a website with lots of information on it, and please just have a look. And then, of course, at Cream as well. Okay, thank you very much.